In these next few videos, we're going to be taking a look at Substance Designer and Substance Painter. The end goal is to get us set up with a model and textures that are ready to be painted inside of Substance Painter. But before we get there, we're going to have to go to Substance Designer, and we're going to have to take a look at how we can build a graph network to where we can take our high resolution geometry and bake that down into our different maps, and then get everything set up so we can push everything on over to Substance Painter. So before we get there, we're going to start over inside of ZBrush, and we're going to take a look at the model that was created for this. And we're also going to be taking a look at some best practices for getting our work outside of ZBrush and getting our models prepped so we can put them in Substance Designer. So let's go ahead and get started. So the first thing I want to talk to you about is material ID. So you can see here in this map that was baked off for the helmet of this character, we've got some kind of interesting colors going on here, where you can see that if I go ahead and take this node here and I'll view this, and I'll view this as the color map, you can kind of see a little bit more clearly what's going on with these colors. These colors actually equal out different pieces of the model and what might be considered different materials for this thing. So before I switch this over, we had this area that was red, maybe a kind of a white plastic, and then this blue area was being driven as if it was a darker kind of metal, and then the visor had its own kind of color and shading going on with that as well. So you have to generate this type of map to be able to use that type of functionality. So it's actually pretty easy to set some of this up inside of ZBrush. So let's hop on over there and take a look at what needs to be done. So you can see here in ZBrush, we've got our model that we're going to be working with. I want to work with just the helmet because that's the piece that we were looking at in Substance Designer. So I'm going to hold down Alt and then click on this right here, and you can see it's highlighted the helmet here, or we can go into the subtool area and navigate and find it through there. I'm just going to put this on solo, so we're just working with that one piece, and tap F real quick, and I'll kind of frame in on that model. I'll tap F again, it should fill the entire screen with that. The next thing I'm going to do is make sure that I've got poly painting turned on, and you can see here are the colors that have been filled with this. If you're not familiar with poly painting, it's pretty simple. You need to have this enabled here, or you can go to the poly paint area right in here, make sure that colorize is turned on, and that's going to give you the ability to start painting with something. So if we have our brush type on, we're just going to use standard, and I'll put this on RGB and turn off Z-add. And if we pick a color, any color should do for this, and you start to paint on here, you can see we're actually painting those individual polygons this different color that we have here, like this. If that's not working for you, the first time that you do this, you might have to go to color, and you can say fill object, like that, and you can see it's whatever is visible, it's going to fill that with, and hit undo for that. So I've actually taken parts of my interface, and I've got this color fill object. You can see it's put here on my interface right there. So I might be using that quite a bit. The other thing is, if you turn on poly groups and we take a look at that, you can see that if you hold down Control and Shift, you can click on a poly group and you can just show that poly group, right? And then we can actually use that fill object button that we had here, or go to color and fill object, and whatever color that you have here in the foreground is what's going to be filled. So we can go color fill object, like that, and that's how we can get different sections filled pretty quickly. So that works pretty well with the poly groups that are generated with the panel loops and stuff like that. I'm going to hit undo and get back to the colors that we had before. But you can see I am using some very specific colors on this thing. And the reason for that is, we'll go over here and we'll take a look at a material selector that they've got in here. It's just a node, and if you double click on it, you can see what it allows you to do. You can go ahead and find a map that has this color bake out on it, and I'm going to zoom out on this thing a little bit, and here's the map. Here's our color selector, and then with this thing you can tell it how many colors you want to use to maybe build a mask for it, right? And so it's got these colors that are already predefined, and you can change them, but if we enable more colors that we can pick from, you can see that these are the colors. It's choosing you know, pure red, green, blue, and if we keep going down, it's going to be choosing like this yellow color and some of these other colors here. And you can see what this is. It's just a 255 for red and green, and has 0 for blue. And this one's got 0 for red, 255 for that one. So they're using some color choices that make a little bit more sense, as far as like if you want to try to pick a color that this color doesn't get too close color wise to some of these other ones. So the computer has a easier time kind of picking these things out. So I'll put these back to false like this. The other cool thing about these this color picker thing is if you can actually just make a specific color that you want. And how this kind of works with this map is you would select this thing here and then say pick, and then you can pick anywhere off of that map that you baked. So it's not critical that you use these colors, but it does make your life a little bit easier to actually have this kind of set up with Substance Designer. So knowing that, I kind of built a map for myself where I could kind of pick colors from this. So if I go to the texture area, and I'm going to go ahead and import in a texture, and I have an area for all my different ZBrush tools and stuff like that. And then under Spotlight, I made this texture map inside of Photoshop. And you can see it's got the primary red, green, blue, the yellow. I was trying to match those colors that you saw inside of Substance Designer, and then we got a pure white and pure black. So if we take that and we load it up as a texture, we can actually take that, select it, and then we can add that to Spotlight. So I'll go ahead and click that, and that'll add it to Spotlight. I can hit the comma key to get rid of the light box stuff. Don't want to see that. And if we just click on this image, we can click and move it around. This one's scale, so I'll just click and drag that down and push it off to the side here a little bit. And you can see it's see-through right now. So there is a opacity, so you just click and drag this way and give it 100% opacity. And then I'll click and drag and put it right here, and then I can just click on the canvas like that, and that'll put my spotlight ring down here. So I can tap Z to turn on and off the spotlight ring, and as long as I have that ring open, I can click and drag, and I can pick different colors off of this thing that I made here, like this, right? If I tap Z and I click and drag, you can see it doesn't pick up those colors anymore, which is a little confusing. I can click and drag out to any place on the model that I might have color, and it'll pick. But if I go to that image, it won't pick up. So just tap Z for that, and then you can click and drag out for that image like that. So Z turns this on and off to where it's got this ring here. And if you want to hide it completely, you just hit Shift Z. And if you want to bring it back, Shift Z again. So get used to those hotkeys, Z and then Shift Z whenever you're using the spotlight. But this makes it pretty easy for this setup to pick the colors that you want and then start to fill your object with those different colors. So you can see, if you kind of think about this, you can always say your primary color is going to be red, secondary color might be blue, and tertiary color is going to be green. And if you kind of follow that, most of your designs is going to just have maybe 4 to 5 different colors on it, or maybe even different material types. So if you think about that, you can use this setup and make it kind of easy on yourself a little bit later on for things. So that's kind of some best practices there for making sure that you've got your color set up correctly. And let's look real quick. I'll show you the rest of the model here. And it's going to look purple because I have purple selected as a color here. That's not actually the color that I have for my character. Now, this is going to run kind of slow. This is a really very heavy model. There's a lot of polys on this thing. So it is going to run a little bit slower. So if I go to my subtools section, you can see I don't have poly painting turned on for all these other pieces. So that means whatever color that I pick over in here, it's going to make the model look like that color. Now there's an easy way to turn on color for all of our objects. We can just hold down Shift and click on this little icon here for the brush, and then at that point it'll show you all the different poly painting colors that are on here. So this is the color scheme that I chose for making the material ID. So you can see I try to follow a very similar pattern for the entire character, and also for the different pieces that the character has within its body. So a setup like that is going to definitely help you later on down the road. So it does take some time to kind of set this thing up and get all your colors correct, but once you set this up, it's going to make your life a lot easier whenever you go to paint your textures. Alright, now that we know how to manage colors, let's start talking about how we manage our meshes, especially when we have a model that is extremely dense like what we see here for this one. It's made up of a lot of different pieces, and it's pretty complex, right? So I'm going to start controlling this by using visibility. So I'm going to click on this chest piece that you see here in the subtool area, and I'm going to hold down Shift and then just click this eye icon, and just like the painting ability, when you hold down Shift and click that, it turns everything else off, and it allows you to just start going and picking the different pieces that you want to turn on. So I'm going to try to choose the maybe the shoulder piece here, and maybe these shoulder parts here, the neck, the back of this, and I think that should be pretty good for about now. I think this will get the point across. It doesn't have the inner parts of the body, but we'll deal with that. I'm actually going to turn the shoulder thing off just real quick like this. So let's just say we've got this piece here, and we want to start working with this. And I do think you're going to have to kind of be smart about how you break this thing apart as far as how many polygons that you're going to be working with. So if I hover my cursor over the top of the model that's selected, you can see it's got a count for total polys that is making up the entire model. So the entire model is over 40 million polys, which is pretty dense. But it looks like this particular piece that we have here is maybe a little over just a little bit shy of 4 million polys. So if we take a look at the other pieces that we have selected in here, like the shoulders, and just go over the top of that, you can see that this one is not quite a million for that, but we're starting to get pretty big poly counts on here. So let's hover a cursor over this one here, and you can see that this one is almost 150,000 for this. The back is pretty high for that. The back is actually over 7 million for that. So some of these got pretty darn high, right? So I think that's a lot of geometry to kind of be working with. So we can kind of split this thing off. We can do this thing called merge, and we can do a merge visible. And if we do that, it's going to run through and it's going to try to merge all these subtools together into one tool. You might expect it to do it in the current tool that you're working with, but what it does is it goes up into your tool area where it's got all the different models, and it makes a whole new version for you up in here. So let's go ahead and click on that and take a look. And it's going to give it the name merged, and then maybe whatever that first object was in the stack, it's going to take that name from that. So we can call this, we just hit rename, and maybe call this torso, like that, right? Something like this. And if we hover a cursor over the top of it, again, this is the total poly count that we've got for this thing, and it is currently a little over 12 million polys. Pretty darn dense, right? So how can we start working with this to make sure that we can get these in other programs, and we can kind of manage this a little bit better? There's a plugin inside of ZBrush that we can go to their plugins area, and it's called Decimation Master. Decimation Master is going to take your model and it's going to drop it down in the poly count area, but it's going to try to keep the visual for it. So they've got, if you have UVs, you can keep the UVs. If you have poly paint, like what we do, you want to tell it to use and keep poly paint. In the older versions of ZBrush, this option was stored in the preferences, area, and now it's been moved into the actual plugin area, which is pretty nice. So you've got this slider for polypaint weight, so it's going to look at the polypaint and try to reduce the polygon count and take the amount of polys that are colored into consideration for that. So I'm just going to leave it exactly where it is for this. So for this tool to work, you're going to have to click this pre-process current, and then it's going to go through a computation process, right? So you can see at the top it's going to tell you pre-computing current tool. It's going to generate a file for it, and when that's done, you can go ahead and say percentage of decimation, and then you can drop down the poly count for that, and then click this decimate current. What that's going to do is drop down, so say if your mesh was 100,000 polys and you do this 20% of decimation, it's going to drop it down to 20,000. The other thing you can do is if you want a very specific poly count that you're trying to hit, you can put in K polys here. So right now it's at 200, so that means it would try to force the model down to 200,000 polys. So if you needed a model to be 1,000, you would put the number 1 here and say decimate current. So it does take a little bit of time for it to generate this file that it's doing with this pre-process current. So I'm going to pause the video and then come back whenever it's done. But this all depends on how many polys that you have within the model. Again, this was 12 million, so it's going to take a little bit of time to get this finished up for this model. But if you've got a lower poly count, you should be pretty good, and it shouldn't take quite as long. Now, just a little note about poly count and going into Substance Designer. With this model that I have here, I was really trying to push the boundaries and the limits and see what I could get away with this. And Substance Designer is really good at handling a lot of different polys, and you can throw a lot at it. It's going to take longer for it to bake everything, but it will handle pretty large models. So in Maya, I would always try to get my models down to maybe 1 million to 2 million polys, somewhere around there. And with an X-normal, I was getting, a little bit higher, 3 to 4 million. And with Substance Designer, I'm starting to feel pretty good about getting chunks of models in there that maybe are 5 to 7 million or somewhere in that neighborhood. And I can take multiples of those different models and do one bake at the same time. So obviously the lower your polygon count is for everything, the quicker things are going to kind of bake, but you do need to kind of watch with this Decimation Master plugin. If you drop it too low, you'll start to see kind of hard edges and faceting within your model, and that's definitely not something you want after you've spent all this time making a really beautiful high-res model. You want to keep those nice smooth shapes for whenever you bake your normal maps, because those edges will actually show up within there. Alright, now that the model's pre-processed, it's time for us to be able to start playing around with these numbers and dropping this thing down. So we could just leave it at the 20% of decimation, or we could drop this down to a number that I usually use is right around 12%. And I'm going to go ahead and click this decimate current after I do that, and you can see it's going to read the file that it generated, and then it should kind of spit this thing out. And if everything goes right, you probably won't even notice any kind of difference, but you can see the cursor turns red, and that lets you know that it's done doing what it needed to do for the reduction. Now if we turn on the poly frame, we can take a look at what's going on with this thing. So you can see it's selectively keeping edges that needed to be held for detail, and then reducing other areas to get that polygon count down. So after we're done, we can take a look at what the actual poly count is been dropped down to. So now you can see that we're really close to about 3 million polys on here, like that. So you can see with this number, if we wanted to drop this down to 2 million, we could type in 2000 here for this number and say decimate current, and then we could just let it run through. And once it gets done, you can see it's going to kind of change this mesh a little bit. But that's kind of the cool thing about this this process is after you do the pre-process current, you can sit there and interactively change these numbers and get it down to a level that you are happy with. So I think this looks pretty good for reducing the polygons and keeping the poly paint and everything for this. So when you're happy with the model that you have, all you have to do to export it out is you can go to the tool area and say export, and you can export this out as an OBJ file. You can store it anywhere you want, and you can call it something like, usually I call this high and then put like deci for decimation for that, so I can kind of keep track of whether I've got something decimated or not. Sometimes the model's within range without decimating it, so I can just put high on there and I know that I didn't do anything for decimation for that. So that's usually how I kick that out for that. Now, I need to talk to you a little bit about the OBJ format. So whenever you export out an OBJ from ZBrush, it doesn't have any information for the normals on your edges. So within ZBrush, there is no softening of normals, so everything is hard edge. So if we get in really, really close to this thing, we can take a look at the polys that we have on here, and you can see these different hard edges on here, and you can see the hard edges along these different lines. Substance Designer doesn't, if it doesn't get any information from another program, it's going to soften the edges for you. And whenever that happens, I've gotten some not so good normal map bakes whenever that happens. Now, the new version of ZBrush has a new plugin within it for exporting out FBXs. So there's you can see under my Z plugins, just went to here, and then we can dock that over. Same area for the Decimation Master, but we can go right under here for FBX import and export. And you can see we can export visible, and we can tell it what version of the FBX we want. I'm using Maya up coordinates, so we've got that set here. And you can see if you want to soften the normals, you can do that. And if you have this deselected, it's going to export with hard edges on there. So you can just go to export right here with this button, and it's going to export the same way that the OBJ would, but it's going to give you that normal information that you're looking for. They've also has some options on here where you can export your poly groups as materials. So if you have that turned on, you can actually export out this information that might be on there for the poly groups, gets exported out as what is seen as materials, and it just kind of breaks up the model. And Substance Designer can actually recognize that as well. So not only can you spit out color information with the vertex color, you can also export out the poly group information and use that for other things as well. I haven't really explored too much with it, but it would just be another selection type that you could have at your disposal. So that's a little bit about how to get this model out of here. So this would be the high-res portion of this. We can go back to Decimation Master. So let's say you wanted some kind of proxy model to push just for some kind of shape recognition somewhere else. So we could put this number of polys, we could put this maybe down to 15 or something for 15,000 and just say decimate current, and you can see here's what we have here. It's not a very good model by any stretch of the imagination, but it does have enough there to kind of show you what the shape is for that thing. So again, after you've dropped it down, you could export that thing out as an OBJ. If you need an FBX, you could do that as well. I'm going to put this thing back up to about 20% of decimation, and we've got this fairly decent looking model that we have here. And the next thing that we're going to talk about is, what if we needed to generate some decent topology rather quickly, and we're using the part in ZBrush called Z-Remesher. It's possible that we could take this model that we have here, and we can use another technique where we can go to geometry and go to decimation, not Decimation Master, go to Dynamesh, and I'm going to turn this project off in this blur here, and I'm going to put this at 512 and click the Dynamesh button and see what we get from this. Now it should take all of our pieces, merge it together as one continuous piece like what you see here, and give us one model. So this works pretty good for if we're going to send this model over to, say, like Maya, and we're going to do some resurfacing of this thing. That kind of works rather well for this. I'm going to turn off the poly paint information so we can see exactly what we're going to get model wise. So the model looks pretty rough right now, which is fine. The other thing we can do is under geometry, there's this clay polish area, and we can go ahead and hit clay polish and maybe polish it up one more time. And we could leave the model the way that it is. If you see any areas that are really just kind of chunky or so, we could tap X and then maybe just smooth this area just a little bit right in through here. Because what I'm going to do next is use ZRemesher to generate new topology from this thing. And it would work better if all these areas that were the holes were that are open on this thing were closed, and then this was just a one-piece model. But we're going to go ahead and try this anyways and just see what we get from this thing. So we've got pretty much the shape that we need, and it's pretty rough. Again, we could hit clay polish again if we wanted to kind of smooth that out just a little bit. I'm going to hit undo. I didn't really like the results. I think this is somewhat decent for it. So let's just see what happens if we go to ZRemesher and we just take straight out of the box and we put like 10 for our target polygon count here, which means it's going to try to build a mesh that's 10,000 polys off of what we see here. So now we're going to click ZRemesher, and this is without drawing any kind of guide curves or giving it any kind of guidance at all. We're just going to see what ZBrush generates for us. And you can see, obviously, we've got the progress bar up here at the top, and that's going to let you know, how much more time it's going to take for it to generate the mesh for this. So again, this would be kind of down and dirty, and if you need a mesh really quickly and you're not going to resurface it yourself, you could generate a mesh fairly quickly, because you could take this, if we had the inner part and just had the outer shell of this, again, this would have worked better if we would have had the skin under here, so it's all basically a one-piece model at that point. We could actually take this thing, generate UVs for it, and use it for something that we could bake a normal map onto. And baking a normal map from that high-res piece that we just looked at, you can get some pretty decent results. So again, if we turn on the polyframe, we can see the geometry that was spit out for this, and it looks pretty decent. Now, we put it in that target polygon count of 10,000 polys, but let's take a look at our actual geometry count here. So you can see it actually generated 31,000 polys. So it uses that 10 for 10,000 polys. It uses that as a it's going to target that, right? So that's why it says target polygon count. So when you got this adapt on, it's going to kind of look at the model and try to still make the model the best that it can, and still try to, get around that that target polygon count that we put in there. So it's just something to kind of note for that, right? So here's the geometry for this section, this torso that we just looked at. Now I went through and did that same process, but I did it for the entire model. So I took all the pieces of the model, and then I did that merge visible. So I wanted to grab all the pieces for the suit, and then I turned it into Dynamesh, and then used the clay polish, just like what we looked at. And so this is the mesh that was made from that. Okay, so you just saw that same process, but I did that to the entire suit. So hopefully that makes a little more sense. And like I said, this works a little bit better if you have a one-piece model that's entirely enclosed. And so then I just used the ZRemesher to go through and then generate this topology for this. Okay, so this isn't great topology. Like I said, if I want to actually use this for something that's going to articulate and we need to move and have this thing animate, this isn't going to be the best mesh. I'm going to have to go through and really probably do a lot of stuff by hand. But there are parts that I might be able to kind of steal from this. Like there's parts on the leg that maybe I could steal some of what ZRemesher gave me, and then resurface my own parts that I know that need to be very specific, like the joints and things like that. Things like the elbows and the fingers and things like that. So again, it's not too bad of a mesh for just spitting this thing out. Going through that process, right? I'm going to hop on over to Maya, and then we're going to take a look at the rest of the model and some of what was resurfaced for the rest of the model. So here we are inside of Maya, and this is the final topology that I made. This belt and these pouches were made in a very similar fashion to what I just showed you for how we could take the actual high-res models, turn them into Dynamesh and then ZRemesh just to get a model out. But areas where I was very specific about resurfacing this thing, and the difference that you can see in something like this versus something that was resurfaced by hand is here in this helmet. And so you can see I was very specific about the different shapes that I used and how I combined them together. Let me go ahead and see if I can just turn on wireframe on shaded on this so we can take a look. This shoulder piece was another piece that was resurfaced by hand. So you can see I'm trying to be very, very clean with this. Now the advantage of resurfacing by hand is that you get the exact shape that you're looking for, and you get it at the polygon count that you're going for. And I think you can be a lot more specific, a lot more clean. The disadvantage is that it takes a lot of time to resurface by hand. So you saw how quickly you can actually generate stuff using ZRemesher. The drawback with this is that you're not quite as specific with the topology. There are guide curves that you can use, but still it's never quite as good as if you resurface this stuff by hand. So it all kind of depends on, you know, what type of object is it. If it's going to be in the game and you're not really going to be so concerned about the topology, you could probably get away with using some of the different techniques of using Decimation Master and maybe even ZRemesher. And that's if you really don't care about the topology. But if you really care about the topology and it really does matter and you need something very specific, you're going to have to take the time and you're going to have to resurface it by hand. Now the other thing that you can do is try to do the best of both worlds, right? Where you can have the computer auto-generate something for you, and maybe you can get 70% of the way there. Maybe you could even get, you know, 80 to 85 to 90% there with what the computer spits out. And then maybe you need to, you know, chop certain areas off and then build them by hand, right? So a good example of that would be, what if you chopped off the fingers for this and you had to rebuild the fingers? Or what if you rebuilt the hand completely? Or maybe I need to rebuild the elbow area in here or something like that, right? The head was already there. I already had the head from pre-existing topology, so that was pretty easy. So when I go through and I really do this thing for real, I'm really going to need to rebuild the body and these pouches that you see here and get everything to be very specific topology. But it was enough to get everything kind of going and get everything moving. You can see even with the ZRemesher meshes, if we go to take up the UV texture editor window, we can see that here's the UVs that were generated for it. And so we've got the torso part, the bottoms of the shoes, and then we've got things for the arms and then the legs. This is the like the underwear kind of area here, and this is part of, I believe, the back, and then you see the hands here. But you can get a decent layout like that, and I was able to get a pretty decent baking of my different maps as well going in there. So it is going to be a matter of, you know, what exactly are you going for? If you're going for kind of the speed thing, you might have to not be quite as concerned about the topology, and if you absolutely have to make sure something's the exact shape with the right polygon count, then always you know, count for that time that you're going to have to take to resurface that mesh. Okay, so that is an overview of everything that you're going to need to do to your models to get everything prepped to go into Substance Designer. Now that we know about what we need to do to get our models you know, ready for Substance Designer, let's start taking a look at Substance Designer itself, pulling our meshes in there, and then start taking a look at how we can start baking our maps.